You are listening to an Art Media podcast.
What worries Israelis the most is the interim deal between Iran and the US. And why is that? Because President Trump is desperate for achievements. The Russia-Ukraine negotiations had failed. The Israel-Gaza negotiations had failed. So the only achievement that he can have at hand is an interim deal that would reduce the tensions in the Middle East. Problem is that Iran would not give up the crucial ingredient in the survival of the regime, which is the nuclear weapon. So for the first time in the Israeli-US relationship, President Trump confirms publicly that he actually warned Netanyahu not to attack Iran. What our enemies see is that there is a huge daylight between Israel and the US.
It's 10 a.m. on Thursday, May 29th here in New York City. It is 5 p.m. on Thursday, May 29th in Israel, as Israelis wind down their day. Following President Trump's return from Saudi Arabia last week, pressure on Israel by the UK, Germany, France, and also to some degree the US has been steadily increasing to end the war. Now, as we mentioned in last Thursday's episode with Nadav Eyal and Amit Segal, the war in Gaza is tied to the US-Iran nuclear negotiations. Well, yesterday we saw what may be interpreted as major developments on both fronts, terms for a new intermediary hostage-ceasefire deal that were reached by direct negotiations between the US and Hamas, according to reports, and also reports that President Trump told Prime Minister Netanyahu it would be, quote, very inappropriate for Israel to strike Iran's nuclear facilities militarily, at least anytime soon, while these negotiations are ongoing. Steve Witkoff's new proposal on the Gaza front aims to release 10 live hostages held by Hamas in exchange for a 60-day ceasefire in Gaza. This initiative also includes the return of 18 deceased hostages and the resumption of UN humanitarian aid. However, the proposal has met resistance from, among others, right-wing ministers in Israel's government who argue that Hamas is weakened and that Israel should press for a complete surrender rather than a temporary truce. On Iran, in a recent phone call, President Trump advised Netanyahu against launching a military strike on Iran, emphasizing the potential for a diplomatic resolution to Iran's nuclear program. Trump highlighted that negotiations with Iran are progressing and that a deal could be imminent. And he doesn't want that process upended, at least not yet. Despite this, Prime Minister Netanyahu remains skeptical, fearing that any agreement might not sufficiently prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. So to better understand this rapidly evolving, increasingly complex story that involves many facets, many fronts, many characters, we welcome back Nadav and Amit to this podcast. Guys, thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting us. This time from Chicago.
This time from Chicago, exactly. All right. Nadav, can you summarize, let's start with this. Just summarize the different international pressure points that Israel is experiencing right now since President Trump returned from Saudi Arabia, and how coordinated it all is.
So we have 3 points of friction as far as Israel and the regional and the international community. The first one is the pressure by the Trump administration to try to get to an interim deal, a hostage deal, a ceasefire deal as to Gaza. This is the Witkoff plan. Basically, it says on the way to ending the war, we will have another ceasefire and release of Israeli hostages, and the US will give some sort of direction, or as far as Hamas is concerned, assurances that the war indeed is going to end. Israel wants this pathway. Israel does not want a deal of all deals to end the war and get all the hostages back right now, because it feels that Hamas is still very much in power on parts of the Palestinian society in Gaza Strip. But it does want an interim deal. It does want the Witkoff plan, as long as the US supplies it with the same promise that was given by the Biden administration at the time, that it can resume the war if it doesn't reach a settlement with Hamas in the end of the negotiations. This is very much the Biden deal. So this is one element.
The Biden deal from when?
The Biden deal, the May 2024 Biden deal that was demonstrated only when Trump actually came into office and was pushed over the finishing line by Steve Witkoff and by the president. But this was the Biden deal. The Biden deal said, you're going to get some of your hostages back, then you're going to negotiate the end of the war and the return of all the hostages. Israel basically decided not to go through that process because it felt that Hamas will never agree to its terms. The terms are for the Hamas leadership to leave the Gaza Strip, or some of it to leave the Gaza Strip, for Hamas to disarm, and for Hamas to lose control of the Gaza Strip. All the hostages go back home, and to have a different government, of course, in Gaza. Amit published this morning in Channel 12 the details of this Witkoff plan that were sent to Jerusalem late last night. And according to those plans, 9 hostages will be freed. And according to
9 hostages.
Yeah, and according to Amit...
Just one correction, it's 10. There was
10.
misunderstanding in Israel because they thought Idan Alexander was the down payment for this deal. No, it's 10.
Okay. So 10 hostages is what we thought. And Jerusalem argues that the Trump administration will not give guarantees to the end of the war. So it's just a win-win as far as the Israelis are concerned. But, and this is a really big but, the IDF will need to, again, withdraw from all the areas it captured, the Netzarim corridor, the Morag corridor, and return to where it was at the end of the previous ceasefire. And according to this plan, according to what Amit published, and I think that's true, the UN returns to be the main factor of humanitarian aid to Gaza. So the first element is negotiations towards an interim deal. And that's very much in play right now. And the Trump administration is pushing really hard. I think that the Trump administration is going to give some sort of guarantees or statements as to the end of the war. Although Jerusalem is saying absolutely not. Let's see. Jerusalem is also... it said many things during this last week that some of them turned to be not as accurate. That brings me to the second subject, and that's Iran. So
wait, Nadav, you're saying that you actually think the Trump administration is going to provide language that implies an end to war, or explicitly includes an end to war. Is that what you're saying? Which is not what Jerusalem is saying.
I'm saying that the Trump administration is saying on the record, doesn't matter what I say, that this president wants the war to end. And we know that during his conversations with the Qataris, the Saudis, and the UAE, they were absolutely clear about their desire for the war to end, and the president agrees with them. So, and I think this would be delivered to Hamas in a way that will give Hamas the impression that the war will never resume. And I think this deal is different in that sense. And there is a large possibility that the Trump administration will not allow it. But I don't know what the president will decide, in a couple of months from now after the deal is finalized. It's up for the president. Now, the second element is Iran. We know that both Iranians and Americans are relatively positive as to the chances to get to a deal. We know that the president has said on the record that he has advised the prime minister. He didn't want to use the word warn the prime minister not to attack Iran right now. He said it won't be appropriate. I don't remember the exact wording that President Trump used in his Oval Office. This was less than 12 hours after the Netanyahu office denied the reports that this sort of warning was made during the conversation, a report by Barak Ravin in Axios. But Trump just said it on the record in a press conference in the White House that he told the Israelis not to attack Iran because we're in the middle of negotiations. And they seem positive. The third issue is the international community. And what we're seeing there is really, immense pressure on Israel as to the war and the humanitarian situation in Gaza, including some very concrete steps. We have the June summit organized by the French and Saudi Arabia as to Palestinian statehood. that's going to happen, and that's important. The Trump administration is not, as far as I know, cooperating with that summit, and has made sure that Israel knows that it's not cooperating with the summit. But the pressure on Israel is mounting, including main countries in the EU, that are demanding not only stopping cooperation, but also real sanctions. They're saying Israel is Russia, and I'm talking mainly about countries like Spain and other countries. So this also, I would say, is boiling up in terms of pressure on Israel to reach some sort of a ceasefire.
Okay, that sounds, I can imagine, quite alarming, the way Nadav lays it out. If you are sitting in Jerusalem, certainly if you're sitting in the government, the prime minister's office, Amit, what can you tell us from your perspective? You've been reporting it out of Witkoff's New Deal, and also just the genesis of it. What things were quiet. Witkoff gave a statement the other day, basically saying Hamas was not coming to the table, and he seemed to be putting pressure on Hamas, and now there seems to be new momentum. So what's in it, and what changed?
I think there is one major change, and it's not the withdrawal from areas the IDF had conquered since the end of the last ceasefire. The main issue is how the humanitarian aid is provided. And I think Witkoff recognizes what makes Hamas really painful. And this is the new so-called American company providing humanitarian aid in 4 different centers.
This is this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF.
Exactly. Now here's the thing.
You're saying that is a huge problem for Hamas.
It's a huge problem. I'll put it this way. For 19 months, Israel tried to eliminate Hamas as a military force. Now, for the first time, beginning this week, Israel has started fighting Hamas as a government. In just 36 hours, not only the company had provided over 2 million meals to the Gazan population, but it actually created turmoil in Gaza. For instance, you saw a mob of Gazans actually invading the place where Hamas kept the humanitarian aid it had stolen from the population. This is the first time in this war in which the barrier of fear has been broken. The Gazan population sees Gazans in the south getting a humanitarian aid from Israel and from the US. They see them shouting, Trump, 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 and all the best for Netanyahu and the IDF Gazans. Not even in Jerusalem these days, people don't support Netanyahu too much. And then they see an option. A window opens for change in Gaza. Because if Hamas loses its grip over Gazans, it necessarily means his collapse in a few weeks, not a few months, a few weeks. Because the idea behind Hamas ruling Gaza is not Hamas as a government, but Hamas as a mob, as a gang that steals the humanitarian aid. Hence, if the humanitarian aid is transferred directly to the population, Hamas cannot take his portion, his share of this humanitarian aid, then he cannot pay salaries to his terrorists and senior officials, thus ceasing to exist as a government. And this is why Witkoff believes that transferring back the humanitarian aid to the UN and other international bodies, aka giving the humanitarian aid to Hamas, will give them incentive. From what I hear from intelligence sources in Israel, Hamas is horrified from the combination of both assassinating his senior leadership 2 weeks ago, Muhammad Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar's brother, and this one, this step of providing humanitarian aid through American companies. So Hamas, the only question is Hamas that desperate as we speak on Thursday? Or, as I think, he'll give it a go a week or two, because for Hamas, if it doesn't see, or if it doesn't get a guarantee from President Trump or Qatar or Egypt for ending the war, so in Hamas's eyes, he gives up half of the live hostages only to return to the same situation in 60 days from now. Now, for Israel, the dilemma is exactly the same, but not less difficult, because you see the light at the end of the tunnel. For the first time in this war, you see the turmoil in Gaza. You see Israel cleaning Rafah and then Khan Yunis, which means that Hamas's leadership in Gaza is gradually being eliminated. Now, Smotrich, for instance, and many figures in Likud argue, don't stop now. We can keep pushing. We can create more centers to distribute food even in the city of Gaza itself. And in a few weeks, we'll get all the hostages without Hamas surviving, which leaves Hamas with no leadership and no money, which might lead for something dramatic that is going to happen, be it a rebellion or a coup d'etat within Hamas or a new effort to release all the hostages. So this is really different from any other operation from the beginning of the war because it deals directly with Hamas as a government branch.
Okay, Nadav, question then. As I'm listening to Amit, I'm thinking, why didn't Israel do this sooner? This seems, I mean, if what Amit is laying out is this squeeze effect, I heard from Israeli officials for months and months and months, Palestinians are not going to rise up until they think that there's some pathway that's independent of Hamas, and they don't have to worry about retribution from Hamas. I heard this. Ron Dermer said this on my podcast, this explicitly, when people were asking for where's the day after plan. This seems to me like something that could have been done sooner. This approach of heavy military pressure combined with independent, independent path to the Palestinian civilians, in terms of humanitarian aid and food, was something possibly that could or should have been done sooner?
Of course, it should have been done sooner. And this is something that we've been discussing from day one of this war. What does Israel envisions in the Gaza Strip? How does it actually make sure that Hamas doesn't control the Gaza Strip? It's obvious that Hamas is a grassroots popular movement within the Palestinian society. It's unfortunate, I think, for Palestinians. It's unfortunate for me as an Israeli. Therefore, it's not only about cutting its military abilities. There are other commanders. Amit is right that the main commanders of Hamas militarily in the Gaza Strip have almost all been killed. The commander of Gaza is still there, a man called Haddad, who's important, but Israel will get to him at the end. But the question is, as to the Palestinian society in Gaza, how do you make sure that Hamas doesn't have a monopoly over violence? And there are specific answers there. One of the answers, Dan, is very much straightforward, was put by the Americans, actually. Anyone who saw anything in Iraq or Afghanistan, you need to have a military occupation. You need to interact with the local population. You need to make sure that establishments are still being managed, that schools at some points would be open. There are no schools in Gaza since the beginning of the war. You need to control the territory. Israel didn't want to do that. Its military brass didn't want to do that. The prime minister and the government never wanted, they kept on saying on the record that there would be no occupation of Gaza. So what would there be in Gaza? And there were a bunch of answers. And I remember on your show telling the story about how Gallant and the Biden administration and General Fanzel, who's coordinating between the PA and between Israel, had this plan of getting thousands of Fatah people with guns and make them be responsible for territories in which food would be handed. When was that? That was like a year ago when they had this plan. Now, what's the difference between what's happening right now? The difference right now, some would say, is that you don't use local agency of the Palestinian Authority that everybody knows is corrupt and the rest. But if you look at the pictures now in Gaza, if you look at these centers, what do you see there? So there's a core of actually, let's put it, plainly, mercenaries with foreign mercenaries that are there Some of them Americans, some of them are from other countries.
Contractors. We choose to call them contractors.
Okay, sorry. I apologize for not being PC with mercenaries. Yeah, so they are there. Near them, there are Palestinians. These are actually large families, hamulot of Palestinians that were hired by the humanitarian operation that Israel is actually supportive, according to the Israeli opposition, is behind this operation and everything. And these are Palestinians who are standing there with vests and everything, and they've been hired to the job. And now these Palestinians are armed, Dan. It's very important to say that they are armed, okay? And now beyond this circle, you have the circle of the IDF. That is actually securing the entire premises. And if something happens, like things happen in the first and second day of riots there, the IDF is responsible to pull out the American or other contractors out of there. So why didn't we have it at the beginning? So some would say, oh no, the IDF rejected that. The IDF didn't want that to happen. They didn't want these companies to happen. The IDF was very particular, both the current IDF chief and the previous one, that they don't want IDF soldiers to hand over food. But they never rejected the idea that other contractors will hand them. And I know that Amit wants to respond to that.
But Amit is like jumping out of his chair. For those listening and can't watch this, you see Amit is like bouncing. And not bouncing like he is on the basketball court on top of Chicago skyline. Amit, you seem like you want to jump in here.
There was a huge debate over this humanitarian supply. For instance, Minister Gallant, the former Defense Minister Gallant, opposed specifically this way of distribution, and so did Herzi Halevi, the former IDF Chief of Staff, because they argued this would be the first step towards an Israeli military rule over Gaza. So they actually opposed every initiative directed or that looks like the current one. Second, the Biden administration had opposed it for a year. They wanted the humanitarian supply to be provided through the United Nations, which actually led to strengthening Hamas. Now look at the absurd. The United Nations that was initiated in order to help poor people around the world opposes every day issues a few statements against this distribution. The Gazan population enjoys something, and therefore the United Nations is against it. This is crazy stuff. I mean, the fact that it actually shows that their objection to this way does not emanate from they being worried about the population in Gaza, but because they want to keep Hamas. They don't want this war to end when Hamas is not there. This is the thing. And unfortunately, what we see that over the last year, this unholy coalition of the UN and Hamas actually helped this terrorist government to survive. And now when you see the light at the end of the tunnel, everyone is panicked. Now, everyone who really supports humanitarian aid, a real humanitarian aid, and not a budget to Hamas, should actually encourage this initiative. Unfortunately, and the tragedy of Israel, and the reason why at least 200 Israeli soldiers got killed, and the war was prolonged from a few months to almost 2 years now, is because no one actually allowed Israel to operate this huge operation prior to the election of President Trump. Now, when President Trump is in office, it is allowed. And we can just imagine what would have happened had it started in November 2023.
And just to understand, the reason is because I think what you're suggesting here is the Biden administration was too responsive to the conditions of the UN and their various affiliated organs. And they wanted to be in control of any aid coming in. So between the US government and the international bodies, there was no way anything could be done this way. Whereas the Trump administration has gone rogue, and they're less responsive to the international bodies.
Because President Trump doesn't care that Israel or the US would control Gaza. And the Biden administration and the Israeli former figure leaders, Gallant and Halevi, were horrified from the option that Israel would control Gaza militarily, would take control over Gaza's population. And this combination actually stopped Israel from providing the humanitarian aid way, way earlier. But we see how rapidly things change in Gaza. He who controls the food in Gaza controls the Gaza Strip. And I'll explain why. Gaza is a place that relies heavily on humanitarian supply, be it from the UN, UNRWA, Arab countries, Israel, and Egypt. So Hamas doesn't really have to govern Gaza like the US administration governs America or the Prime Minister Netanyahu governs Israel. All he has to do is just to take a portion of the money and the provisions supplied to Gaza. Once you cut his lifeline, you actually kill Hamas without shooting even one bullet.
Okay, so I'm going to beg to differ factually and as to the analysis. First of all, Gaza is producing or has produced before October 7 and has continued to produce, by the way, some
vegetables,
agricultural and food. And that's very material. And I'm not talking like 5 or 10%. It's an agricultural area, and of course during the wartime, it's impossible.
The import surplus was more than, it was
absolutely
10 times fold. Okay.
Yeah, it's absolutely the case. But in terms of food, it produced much of its food. It's not the majority of its food, but much of its food. And since the beginning of the war, it's impossible. But my main thing is about, Israel just wanted to do everything. And it was prevented by the Biden administration, by the UN, by the international community, by Yoav Gallant, by its own chief of staff, and so forth and so forth. The truth is that Israel had, and by the way, still does not have, a vision to what's happening with the local population in Gaza. And at a certain point, President Trump came out with his idea about a voluntary immigration, and this government took this idea and made it its charter for Gaza, but actually it has no idea. And that's the reason nothing happened. The Israeli chiefs of staff are saying, and I think they're saying on the record, the former chiefs of staff, that they never rejected plans to hand out food by other aid organizations to the Gazans, which is what is happening right now. What they didn't want to happen, and this IDF chief, the current IDF chief, and the previous IDF chief, Herzi Halevi, are both saying, and this was a shouting match then during the cabinet meetings, in which the current chief of staff, nominated by Netanyahu, shouted that he is not willing for the IDF to hand over food to the Gazan population. Why? Because the IDF, not only the previous IDF, but also the current IDF, thinks it would be a terrible, terrible mistake. I don't think that the international bodies or the Biden administration, if Israel would have come to them and said, you know what, we're going to hand out food too. You're going to hand out food. We're going to hand out food. What do you care? It's our responsibility according to the Fourth Geneva Convention. We need to hand out food. Right? We're the occupied force right now. I don't think that they would ever get a veto to that. Israel never produced a coherent plan. It took Israel, an eternity to produce this plan. And it's a very, very complicated plan. Why? Because it's a humanitarian effort that Israel denies that it's funding. Its opposition is saying that it is funding. I don't also agree with Amit saying that food is everything in Gaza. In Gaza, you control everything through the guns that you have. It's the guns that matter, not the food. Why? Because all of these people who are taking the food back home can be robbed on their way back home, and might be robbed, and some of them are being robbed by people who are carrying guns, most of which are controlled by Hamas. So in order to win this, it's not only about food, it's about having the guns. Monopoly over violence is the most important thing in taking over a territory. Whoever has the guns can control the food distribution. What Israel is doing right now, it's trying to bypass it. I think it's a positive development. And I've just written it, I just saw a professor in the LSE on Twitter saying, showing the picture of people waiting in queue, trying to draw a parallel between this and something else. And he said, something like, whatever stands behind this principle needs to go away from the world, needs to disappear from the world, whatever ideology. And I wrote back, the ideology standing behind people queuing up to foods in Gaza with an Israeli-supported operation is the idea that if you control a piece of territory, you are responsible to some extent to supplying aid or assisting aid reaching to these people. This is a humanitarian idea. And I think that if I agree with him with one point, if the Israelis would have done this much earlier with a coherent plan, with the resolve of their political leadership and also their defense apparatus, I think that would have helped, fantastically to winning against Hamas. But let's keep our eyes on the ball. And the ball is disarming Hamas in a way, if it is even possible.
Before we move off this Gaza issue, there are reports that there are tens of thousands of Hamas fighters still in Gaza. Now, obviously, how one defines a Hamas fighter, the standard, the quality, the professionalism of the fighter, the commandos that invaded southern Israel on October 7th were a whole other level, I think, of quality, shall we say, in terms of fighting capability relative to the kinds of fighters they're recruiting now. That said, the numbers that are being thrown around in some public reports is something like 40,000 fighters. And the tunnel network, while a lot of it has been destroyed, a lot of it is still operational and it's still extensive. So I open that to either of you. What do you make of those reports, and how worried should Israel be about that?
Israel, first of all, Israel destroyed 25% of the tunnel system, but it's the strategic 25%. The main intersections, for instance, so under hospitals. As for the armed people, I think Gaza will never get short of two things: young anti-Jewish males and weapons. What Israel can do is actually eliminate Hamas as an army, and this is what it is doing now, as an army and as government. To tell you that we will destroy each and every tunnel and that we eliminate the anti-Semitism and the hatred, maybe in 200 years.
This is the same kind of, counting bodies is the same kind of mistake done, the famous mistake done as to Vietnam. And to an extent, at some point during the Iraq War, although the US, and you know this better than I do, Dan, did learn a lesson from Vietnam in Iraq, try to implement a lesson. But if the local population is still supportive of Hamas, and some of it is, you'll find the fighters, because in Gaza today, $10 a week is a lot. And you will find people to grab a rifle and fight the Israelis. And that's the reason why the main question is who's going to control Gaza. Now, let me just quote the IDF to the cabinet more than a year ago. In Gaza, you have three options. This is the IDF, Herzia Levi's IDF, now being, trashed by the Netanyahu people. You have three options. The first option is Hamas. They are in control of the Palestinian society right now in Gaza. They might be losing it as we speak, but they were. The second option is Fatah. Fatah is the other party controlling the PA.
Which they're in Ramallah in the West Bank. And they used to be in Gaza before Hamas drove them out.
Yeah. The third option is military occupation of the Israelis. That's it. There's not going to be an invention here. There's not going to be a new startup.
Can I give you a fourth option?
Yeah.
A fourth option is the PA option, which is basically the powers that be in the West Bank resuming power in Gaza. But I have a hard time believing they will be able to pull that off, both based on their competence and their strength.
By Fatah, I mean PA, right?
Yeah, PA, that's what I know. But they're not going to be able to pull it off without Hamas having some kind of seat at the table.
Okay, so exactly. And that's what worries Israel. Israel is worried that this would be the Hezbollah model in which Hamas still has the monopoly over violence. Now, and
as one Israeli official put it to me recently, the biggest setback for Israel, the worst outcome of all of this, is that if there's any semblance of Hamas rule in Gaza, even if the PA comes in and it's Abu Mazen or his successor and it's their infrastructure, but it's well understood that Hamas, they have some kind of deal with Hamas and Hamas has some presence. The message to the region for Israel would be devastating, that after all that has happened and since October 7th, the idea that Hamas could still kind of crawl out of the rubble and have a seat at the table is strategically the worst of all worlds.
They will crawl out of the rubble because as long as they are Palestinians supportive of Hamas, Hamas will have some sort of ability to leverage this into, I don't want to say seat in the table, but this is, you're really hitting the issue that should have obsessed Israeli decision makers from day one. Not the number of tunnels, not the number of fighters, but how do we maintain this? And one of the things that we're seeing in Gaza, I think is positive, is that the Israelis, through this operation that Israel says that it's not behind of, are trying to think this through, but they didn't think that through. The IDF got from the Israeli government something that no other IDF has ever gotten. They just were told, unlike in 1948, 1967, 1973, they were told, you can do whatever you need to do and you have time. What we call the political clock to end the war, the moment in which the UN decides at 6 p.m., all forces stop shooting. This was always the nightmare for an IDF commander, that at a certain point, they'll tell him, you can't proceed. And they were stealing another minute. Always the IDF was looking for more time. Suddenly in this war, the government said, you have loads of time. Do whatever you need to do. Go ahead. There is no world. The Americans are with us. October 7 was so terrible. Do what you need to do. And
But in fairness, that's what initially Biden was giving Israel time.
Yes. I don't think that this was a misrepresentation. Yeah. I think that the time always ends, specifically for Israel. And this is something that the founding fathers knew very well. This is the reason David Ben-Gurion said, have short wars. Because he knew, even after the Holocaust, which was more terrible than October 7th to the Jews, that even if you are the victim, you need to act very realistically. And now we'll see if the Trump administration is, making that phone call, saying you're out of time with this interim agreement. I don't know. According to Witkoff's last proposal, as far as I know, as far as Amit published, it's not saying, we're committed to ending the war anyhow. There's nothing there that gives that sort of assurance.
Right. I just want to add, because I think it has, we talked a lot about Gaza, but the main issue here is Iran.
Yeah, so let's talk about Iran. So go ahead.
Witkoff got three minor missions to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, to get a nuclear deal with Iran, and to end the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. And then the question arises what he does after noon, because usually people finish their tasks before lunch. He has a lot on his plate. And I think what the US is trying to do is to actually reshape the Middle East according to the needs of the US and its allies. Now, it would, in my opinion, it will not tell Israel to stop the war. It would not put a ban on the import of ammunition, but the main risk lies within the nuclear deal with Iran. And here's the thing, what worries Israelis the most is the interim deal between Iran and the US. And why is that? Because President Trump is desperate for achievements. The Russia-Ukraine negotiations had failed. The Israel-Gaza negotiations had failed. So the only achievement that he can have at hand is an interim deal that would reduce the tensions in the Middle East. Problem is that Iran would not give up what makes the crucial ingredient in the survival of the regime, which is the nuclear weapon. So it gets a year, probably a year, give or take, and it gives nothing in return. Not the ballistic missiles program, not the nuclear, dismantling the nuclear program. There isn't a single laboratory that is going to be blown up, as President Trump had said yesterday. And this is why it is so dangerous. And when you add to this the fact that for the first time in the Israeli-US relationship, President Trump confirms publicly that he actually warned Netanyahu not to attack Iran, not to defend itself. I know he does it in a relatively modest way. He does not lecture Netanyahu, but what our enemies see is that there is a huge daylight between Israel and the US. It is big as the range between Israel and Iran.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's as big as the distance between Israel and Iran, but let me give you a contrarian take. Hear me out. What if President Trump has already green-lighted an Israeli military operation against Iran at some point? Some kind of strike, not immediately, but at some point he will be on board with it. And that right now Iran is being tricked into giving up its stockpiles, giving Israel time to strike at some point later on, or strike and reattack for as long as it needs to without fear of Iran racing to immediate breakout. I mean, Hamas has already seen, by the way, Trump has no problem breaking a deal with bad actors once, like in the Witkoff, the first Witkoff deal, once hostages were returned, then the U.S. pulled back from its commitment to move to the final phase, and then Trump started talking about moving Palestinians out of Gaza entirely. So, what if Trump plans to do the same here to Iran once there, if there is some kind of interim deal and the nuclear materials are out of Iran?
So you say that it's a deception plan aimed at taking this stuff out of Iran and then attacking it.
It's a win-win. Let's put it that way. At a minimum, even if Israel doesn't attack, the U.S. is getting the stockpiles out of Iran, and it could be a way to give Israel the option to attack without having to worry about the speed with which Iran moves to a breakout in the event that Israel does decide to attack. It just creates more options.
I wish it is the case. I wish it was the case. I'm just not sure, because I don't think the vivid democracy of Israel is built to such a deception scheme. And what I hear from senior officials in Jerusalem is more and more hysterical. There was a tension in the air over the last 2 weeks of something imminent militarily, and it wasn't yet another attack on Gaza. So I think this phone call was original. It was not a fake phone call, coordinated.
But you do remember when you say the government's hysterical, the government was also hysterical during the first hostage deal, including many on the right in the government.
No.
Criticized the hostage deal, and it turned out once the Trump administration got what they wanted out of that deal, or at least out of phase one, it seemed that Trump couldn't care less about where the deal, went, and he ultimately blessed Israel going back to war. I'll
say again, I wish it was the case. I'm not sure it's the same, because I know that Israel didn't want these negotiations, and Israel didn't want these things to happen. So to be honest, if one day we wake up and Netanyahu and Trump hold a press conference saying, hey, we cheated the Iranians, I'll be the first to be very, very happy. I'm just not sure this is the case.
Yeah, I have a slightly more positive outlook as to this. I think that this might have been played out more hostile than it was really. According to my sources.
Meaning they may have projected publicly that there was more tension between Washington and Jerusalem than there actually is.
The U.S. is definitely using the military threats made by Israel as credible in order to get the Iranians to agree for more during the negotiations. This is for sure. This is for a fact. Now, does this conversation help project a credible military threat? The conversation that was made by President Trump to Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying, don't attack now. I think it does. And I think that to a large extent, this is like damage control, because there were people in the Trump administration that gave the Iranians the vibe that nothing's going to happen to Iran anyway, even if they don't reach a good agreement. It wasn't the president himself. The president himself was very careful to make sure that all options are on the table. There is a quote there that Israel might lead an attack, or we will lead an attack, or something like that. You remember that, I think, in the Oval Office. But there were other people in the administration, and I think that the Iranians are trying to bank on these people to make sure that, at any rate, even if the negotiations fail, they won't be attacked. And the fact that Israel is out there, and by the way, this was the same during the Obama administration before the JCPOA, the fact that the Israelis are saying, we're willing to do this, we will do this, I think this helps the negotiations be more fruitful as far as the U.S. is concerned. But I agree that at the end of the day, the U.S. is maintaining a very clear position that they want an agreement. And one of the things we need to think about, Dan, in that sense, is Gaza. I wrote about this last week, about Gaza for Tehran. Okay, so I think we should look at this as a sort of a trade-off. Even within, and your input here, Dan, could be really important, even within the American sphere. Is it possible that the U.S. is for now weighing towards Israel with this Witkoff proposal and in other elements in Gaza, knowing that it's going to proceed to an agreement with Tehran anyway? Or might it be the other way around, that the Israelis, the U.S. would come to Israel and the U.S. would say, the negotiations with Tehran collapse. We heard your conditions. We know how this plays out to your strategy in the region, but now you're going to walk with us to the end of the war in Gaza. Okay, and I think about this even within the Republican Party, within the people that support Israel. I think it's going to be very challenging to this American administration to come and say to not only to the Israelis, but also partners in the region, hey, we're going to end the war in a way that Hamas is still a player in Gaza, and we're also going to sign an agreement with the Ayatollahs. And there was a question yesterday in the White House that really made President Trump angry. It came from a reporter, and she said something like chicken out, about Trump chickening out.
On the tariffs. It was about the tariffs.
Yeah,
I think... she used the acronym that someone on Wall Street used, that she was quoting. That she said it's taco. Trump always chickens out.
And
about the tariffs.
If Trump got angry, it means that something dramatic happens because he's the calmest guy around.
Yes. So Trump didn't like the question. And I think that one of the points that is being made by Israel's friends in Washington and by Israel is that the U.S. should not this time compromise and sort of push the negotiations so that they will last with no deadline at all, and for this to become what happened between Russia and Ukraine, which we know that the president is very unhappy with the situation right now.
Yeah, well, I would say, Nadav, and I think we've talked about this in a previous conversation, you'll be hard-pressed in the few months since President Trump has been president for this term, you'll be hard-pressed to find congressional Republicans challenging administration policy, even challenging the direction of administration policy on virtually any issue, really. And I was struck in the last couple of weeks when 52 of 53 Republican senators signed a letter really challenging what seemed to be the Witkoff where Witkoff was heading directionally, and obviously establishing the zero enrichment condition, which it's not clear that's where the administration was, or at least where Witkoff was early on. And it's one thing for Republican senators to communicate that behind the scenes, behind closed doors, but to do it in such a public way, to me was relevant to what you're talking about right now. And I don't think Republicans can. I think it's where they are generally from a principle standpoint, and also the politics of their base, can go back to their base and say, we've just cut a deal that's basically a watered down or heated up version of the JCPOA, of the Obama-Iran deal, and we've pressured Israel to wind down its war against Hamas. I think that is a tough pill for Republicans in their states and congressional districts. All right, Nadav, Amit, we will leave it there. I'm sure we will be regrouping shortly. In spite of Amit's global travails. We will be reconnecting soon. Until then, thanks for this, guys.
It's always 5 o'clock somewhere.
All right, fair enough. Okay. Even when you're shooting hoops at Obama's basketball court.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
you
so
guys.
much. Thanks.
That's our show for today. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with others who might appreciate it. Time and again, we've found that our listeners are the ones driving the growth of the Call Me Back community, so thank you. And to offer comments, suggestions, sign up for updates, or explore past episodes, please visit our website, arkmedia.org. That's arkmedia.org, where you can deepen your understanding of the topics we cover. Call Me Back is produced and edited by Alon Benatar. Sound and video editing by Martin Huergo and Mary Angelis Burgos. Research by Gabe Silverstein. Our music was composed by Yuval Semo. Until next time, I'm your host, Dan Senor.